I'm Ann Bocock, and welcome to Between the Covers. In 1968, an African-American factory worker in Virginia suffered a head injury and was admitted to a Richmond hospital. Within 24 hours, the man's heart was removed and was now beating in the chest of a white businessman. The circumstances surrounding Bruce Tucker's death and the race to successfully transplant a human heart are chronicled in a new book by Chip Jones. The book is The Organ Thieves. Chip is an award-winning journalist, a Pulitzer Prize nominee, and the author of several books on military history. Chip Jones, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ann. It's great to be here.
This book is a medical drama. It takes place during the South in segregation, and Bruce Tucker is at the heart of this story. Now, it's all true. And what I'd like is to look at page 1, because there's a phone call from Bruce's brother to Doug Wilder. Now, just for a little background, Doug Wilder at this point in time is a young attorney who later became the governor of Virginia. And Doug Wilder was also the grandson of slaves. So, Chip, if you could start on page 1, please.
Sure. This is chapter 1, Case of the Missing Heart. In late May 1968, Doug Wilder was in his law office on a tree-lined street in Richmond, Virginia. He was winding down from a long day of work when the phone rang. "They took my brother's heart," the man on the other end of the line exclaimed in horror. As one of the best-known African-American trial lawyers practicing in the state capitol, Wilder was accustomed to taking random phone calls, day or night. Accusations of rape, robbery, and murder were not uncommon, nor were other desperate pleas from mothers and fathers seeking help for loved ones who'd run afoul of the legal system. Even as halting steps towards progress had begun to bring incremental improvements in schools, housing, and jobs, his home state of Virginia was still moving at a snail's pace from under the heavy burden of centuries of discrimination. But taking a man's heart from his own body? Wilder had never heard of such a thing. "I don't understand what you're talking about, not having a heart," he told the caller, William Tucker. "What do you mean? What happened to it?"
And what happened to it really is the story of the Organ Thieves. Chip, could we step back just for a moment? I want to know who Bruce Tucker was and how did he end up at MCV?
Sure, Ann. Well, Bruce Tucker was a factory worker in Richmond. He had a steady job for over a decade that I know of at a egg plant, actually, in Shockoe Bottom area, which is down below the capital of Virginia. He was celebrating the end of a work week with his friends up on Churchill, which is right above there for anyone who's ever been to St. John's Church, Patrick Henry's famous giving liberty or giving death. That's where that was done. And he was just down the blocks from that church, celebrating the end of the week with some friends. He was having a drink. He fell off a brick wall and hit his head and suffered a severe head injury. An ambulance was called, and he was taken to the emergency room of nearby Medical College of Virginia, about a mile away. And he was conscious when he went into the emergency room. His vital signs were stable, and he was admitted. And the beginning of the controversy about what happened to him was that in less than 24 hours, he was had life support removed from him, and the surgeons there had been looking for a donor to do the first heart transplant, and they decided that it would be him, Bruce Tucker. And so by 3:30 the next afternoon, without any knowledge of his family, his heart was removed as well as his kidneys. That is a Bruce Tucker in a nutshell at the beginning of the book.
I'm going to let anyone who is on Facebook and have questions for Chip, they can go ahead and put it in the Q&A, and we will try our best to get to them. Chip, I think we need to look at 1968. Let's look at what a snapshot of America was. There was the Martin Luther King assassination, race riots. We were racing to the moon, but we were also racing to do heart transplantation. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. The entire decade of the 60s, it's been compared to the space race, the race to do the first heart transplant. It was because there was so much heart disease. We'll think back into the 50s and 60s. I get into the book, Dwight Eisenhower had terrible heart attacks while he was president in the mid 50s. So the race, as it were, to find a solution to helping people with severe heart disease was considered one of the major medical challenges of the 20th century. And by 1968, the Medical College of Virginia had brought on board one of the probably top 3 heart transplant experimental surgeons named Richard Lauer. He had been recruited to Richmond in 65 by a very ambitious chairman of the surgery department, David Hume, who himself was a major figure in American transplant history with kidney transplants. So Dr. Hume saw an opportunity to really make a mark for this Southern medical school. And this set the stage, and is what I explore in some detail in my book about the milieu of the hospital and the professional ambitions and drive that led to this moment where I've always said that Bruce Tucker kind of wound up in the crosshairs of history by being rolled into that emergency room as a Black man with very few resources or anybody advocating for him. And while the surgery department there was looking for someone just like him, who they could view as a potential donor to accomplish a transplant, which actually, as you read the book, and we can get into this, those surgeons had helped the man who won the heart transplant race just about 6 months prior to that, Dr. Christian Barnard of Cape Town, South Africa. And Barnard became an international celebrity because he won the heart transplant race, leaving the surgeons who had trained him in Richmond kind of in the dust. And there was a fair amount of resentment within the hospital, and especially with Dr. Hume. So the professional pressures of accomplishing the first heart transplant in Richmond, and it would turn out to be about the, I think, the 9th in the US and the 16th in the world. That's what created the conditions, as it were, for this to happen.
You know, you were talking about Dr. David Hume, Dr. Richard Lauer. As I remember, Hume was somewhat like a medical rock star in Richmond, maybe even equating to maybe a Dr. Fauci today. He had a distinct personality, and his goals were definitely getting that heart transplant. But how much power did the doctors have, and was there any oversight?
I would say the doctors had nearly total power at that point in time, not only at the Medical College of Virginia, but at most major teaching institutions. To get to your second question, there was no oversight to speak of, at least at the Medical College of Virginia. And I think this has been confirmed in different interviews I've done since then around the country. I had a doctor recently tell me from the University of Kansas about being in St. Louis around the same time. When I used the characterization, it was the Wild West for medical research. He said that was exactly right. It was much later into the 80s and 90s where I think it was 84 where Congress passed a transplant law, and the idea of that most people would be aware of with organ donations and procedures to keep things on the up and up. And I want to underline that this book is not against people donating to organ, for organ transplants, because those are needed services. But at that point in Richmond, and at that point, I think through most of the United States, the doctors were, as one of the figures in my book, Jack Russell, the malpractice attorney who defended them, he called them the gods in white coats, and that is pretty much where they were at that point.
There were certainly a lot of egos in that room. You mentioned Dr. Christian Bernard and then Dr. Hume and Dr. Lauer. I'd like to look at the heart recipient for a moment, if we could. He was white. He was a businessman. At the time, what was the storyline in the paper, and whatever happened to him?
Well, just to answer that last question first, his name was Joseph Klett, and he only lived 8 days. So he lived till the following weekend. He was not aware of where this heart was coming from, that it was coming from a Black man. He had nothing to do with that. He was a businessman from Orange, Virginia, which is a small town not too far from Charlottesville in the horse country of Virginia. He suffered severe heart disease his whole life. And he finally kind of was going between the University of Virginia Hospital and finally wound up at the Medical College of Virginia because of Dr. Lauer and his reputation. And when he was really on the brink of death and they were looking for a donor, that's how the heart came into his body.
Did these doctors expect this to be successful?
Yes, they did. I mean, of course, experimental medicine is always risky, and Dr. Lauer and I'm sure Dr. Hume, they both knew that the biggest risk was the risk of rejection and organ rejection, and the immunosuppression, the immunity issues in our bodies. It's an issue that's current today. When you read about the COVID vaccine, how do our bodies' immune systems work? And I'm a lay person and couldn't possibly explain that. But I do quote a number of studies that Dr. Lauer did later, which showed the use of steroids, I think, which he tried to treat Mr. Klett after the transplant occurred, didn't work. And there was it took about 10 years before the immunosuppressive drugs were developed to make it more possible to live, for a few years after transplants.
If you have questions, you can drop them in the Q&A of Facebook and we will get them. Chip, this interesting, because as incredible as the story is that we were just talking about, the book doesn't end there, because there is this dramatic trial a few years later, and the ethical issues of when does life end? Does it end when the heart stops? Does it end when the brain stops? Who decides?
Yes.
This was amazing.
Yes. It definitely pushed the boundaries of both science, law, and ethics. And I try to describe this as well as I can in the book. But the things that we might take for granted now, a concept like brain death, this was actually a very novel concept in 1968. And actually, there is a tension there, which I write about, that the doctors, Hume and Lauer, felt that the law in Virginia had not caught up with the science. The science had been proposed by what was called the Harvard Ad Hoc um, Committee on brain death, and the leading heart surgeons, but especially brain surgeons and other professionals, had decided that the old concept of what's called biological death, which is respiration, pulse, and circulation, heartbeat, that was not current. And so when the doctors were talking to the medical examiner in Richmond, and this was another thing that makes the story even more dramatic. It wasn't the regular medical examiner. It was his junior doctor on duty that weekend, and he pretty much got talked into giving the approval for something that was not allowed under Virginia law. There was no concept of brain death, but they decided to prove to themselves and to the examiner by bringing in a guy doing an EEG on him, on Mr. Tucker, that indeed his brain was not functioning. Therefore, the equipment that runs our body, our breathing, our autonomous functions, as well as who we are as human beings, if our brains aren't functioning, they were saying that he's dead for all intents and purposes. But the thing was, brain death was not in the Virginia law. And the other legal point that I stress in the book is that by Virginia law, and most states, I assume, they would have to wait 24 hours. And they did not wait 24 hours. They waited 3 minutes after they pulled the plug. Why did they do that? Because without moving the heart in within an hour, it wouldn't have been viable for the transplant.
Chip, there are many different threads in this book, and you go into a lot of history. One part is the really dark side of medical history, medical schools, and I'm talking about grave robbers. And here we have grave robbers working adjacent to teaching hospitals. At the Medical College of Virginia, you even have a man who was living in the basement that was doing this not so secret, dirty thing.
Yes. I know a lot of medical historians were aware of this, and a lot of doctors in their training knew or know about the practices that actually created American medical education. This is how it was not only in Richmond, but at Harvard in the late 1700s, at Columbia in the early 1800s, at Penn, all throughout up and down the East Coast where there were medical schools. The only hands-on training was done in dissection classes, and the question was, well, where are we going to find bodies? And there was not refrigeration then, and without getting into too much horrid detail, the bottom line was that the most vulnerable people in our populations, of course, it was Black enslaved Americans in Richmond who died working in fields or in factories. They were not protected; their bodies weren't. So they basically created a criminal enterprise that worked with grave robbers. And this was something that was brought over, incidentally, from England and France. Charles Dickens writes about it in A Tale of Two Cities, for example. And I learned a lot looking at the records of MCV about how they paid and housed a man who lived in the basement of the training school called the Egyptian Building. And his name was Chris Baker. And he lived there for 40 years. And with white criminals working at night, he stole bodies up to around 1900. And this is kind of what blew my mind, Ann, about the story and about a lot of stuff. This went into the 20th century. He lived there till around 19 19, I believe. My father was born in 1916, and I'm like doing the math. Wait a minute, this is not something that was ancient history. This is, I kind of think of it as near history. And as you know, if you get into the book, there was in 1994 a finding of a lot of bodies in a construction site in VCU, what's called Virginia Commonwealth University Health now. And literally the bodies are in the foundation of the medical school today. And I'm not sure they know what to do about that.
There is a documentation of racial discrimination in healthcare, and many people have read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. We know about the Tuskegee syphilis study that experimented with 400 plus Black men. But I tell you, I never heard about this until I read your book, even though I worked in news in that city. Where did you hear about it?
Actually, I first heard about it, Anne, from Doug Wilder, the governor, first Black elected governor, actually in the United States, and the first Black governor of Virginia. And he became the attorney for the Tucker family in 1968. And when I first interviewed Doug Wilder at his office at Virginia Commonwealth, where he has a school of government named after him, he told me about growing up in Richmond, where he was told in the 1930s by his grandmother, don't go down around that hospital. The night doctors will snatch you up. That's what he called them, night doctors. And so that was the first time actually it came to my attention. And then I started looking in the archives of the medical school here, and the records are all there. The payments to Chris Baker, the payments to run the facility, basically. And so I then later did a fair amount of reading. The best book is called Traffic of Dead Bodies by a scholar named Michael Sappol, Sappol, and he was at the National Institutes of Health. And it's a tremendous resource, because what it opened my mind to was that this happened all up and down the East Coast. And there's still reckoning going on, like the New York City quote Negro burial ground, and those bodies were found in the 1990s. So there's a lot of history that is still being reckoned with, I guess is the right word, in the era of Black Lives Matters. And as people point out to me, it really is when Black lives really didn't matter and the bodies didn't matter. And there was such a fundamentally inhuman and really unholy treatment of people's bodies, because by taking them out of the graveyards, they really, it was a complete devastation of the families, but people's religious beliefs too, depending on what those were or still are today. This is really a sacrilege on people's bodies, because some people believe that your body actually has to be there to be resurrected. And so there's so many levels of badness to this. And strangely, there's weird language used, like those body snatchers were called resurrectionists, and it was like a bad joke. They were the resurrectionists. So I learned way too many bad things about how it was done. But what can happen now on a positive note is for historians and students and amateur historians in areas to work together and to honor the graveyards and to try to put together some ways to do that.
I look at the book as, even though this occurred in 1968 and the trial a few years later, that it's absolutely relevant to this minute. We have COVID, Black Lives Matter, perhaps a good teaching tool for medical students. What do you think?
Yes, I really hope so. And also high school students. I'll put in a plug. I mean, there's a really good teaching guide that's free from Simon & Schuster, and a teacher actually put it together. It's definitely a way not just to look at the medical side of things, but the social power imbalances and everything about the country that we've had discussions about over the past year is integral to the story, because it really boils down to race and class, power, institutions, and I definitely think for medical students it's a must read. But I would suggest also it is accessible because it is a popular history. It's not an academic book in terms of telling the story and trying to take the reader there for high school students as well.
Organ Thieves is really about morality. It's a story that looks deeply into justice in the American South. Chip, thank you for writing the book. I want to thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, it has been my pleasure, Anne. Thank you so much.
For more stories with your favorite authors, please connect with us and join me on the next Between the Covers.